Minneapolis, 2016. A woman with a background in early childhood education starts a nonprofit with a simple mission: feed kids who are falling through the cracks. Nobody's watching too closely. Nobody has a reason to. 6 years later, that nonprofit is at the center of what federal prosecutors call the largest pandemic fraud scheme in American history. $250 million gone. This is the story of how a former teacher became, in the government's own words, a mastermind. Amy Bach was a lifelong Minnesotan. She grew up in Cottage Grove and moved to Duluth for college, graduating from the University of Minnesota, Duluth, in 2003 with a degree in education. Before any of this, she was a school teacher who went on to work at daycares and early childhood centers. She wasn't a financial mastermind by training. She wasn't connected to organized crime. She was, by most accounts, an ordinary Midwestern nonprofit administrator, one who, along with a friend and fellow former teacher named Kara Lohman, ran a smaller nonprofit called Partners in Quality Care that helped child care centers get federal meal money. That earlier venture was the training ground. It taught her exactly how the federal child nutrition reimbursement system worked and exactly where its blind spots were. In 2016, Bach founded Feeding Our Future. On paper, it was a sponsor organization, a middleman approved by the state to oversee smaller sites that actually served the meals, then pass along federal reimbursement money. For its first few years, the operation was modest. Feeding Our Future went from receiving and dispersing roughly $3.4 million in federal funds in 2019, a normal-sized regional nonprofit. Then came March 2020. COVID shut down schools, and with them, the usual system of checking who was actually eating a federally funded meal. To keep kids fed during lockdown, Washington waived normal oversight rules. No more surprise site visits, no more strict paperwork checks. It was meant to move money fast to a country in crisis. Instead, it removed the guardrails. In the span of 2 years, Feeding Our Future's federal funding exploded from $3.4 million to nearly $200 million. Dozens of new meal sites popped up almost overnight. Strip mall storefronts, empty warehouses, addresses that, on inspection, served no food at all. Prosecutors would later say the sites falsely claimed to have served 91 million meals, for which they fraudulently received nearly $250 million in federal funds. Here's how the scheme worked, according to prosecutors. Operators would register a meal site, sometimes little more than an address. They'd submit inflated or entirely fake attendance counts, claiming to feed thousands of children a day at locations that, in reality, served a fraction of that or nothing. In one case, prosecutors highlighted years later a single small-town operator claimed to be feeding more children each day than actually lived in the entire town, a number so large it was more than double the site's whole outstate population, adults included. Feeding Our Future, as the sponsor, was supposed to verify numbers like that. Instead, according to a former employee who testified against her, kickbacks flowed the other way. A former right-hand man testified that everyone at Feeding Our Future took kickbacks, describing how he personally made about $2 million running a fake food site while pocketing payments to help others get federal funds. The stolen money didn't stay in bank accounts. It became houses, cars, land overseas. The first real crack in the story wasn't a court filing, It was a wedding video. In January 2022, a Somali community activist posted footage on Facebook. A wedding gift so extravagant it stopped the room. An ornamental cart loaded with so much gold that guests gathered around just to look at it. The activist who filmed it said the gold traced back to food vendors getting rich off Bach's nonprofit, and he wasn't quiet about it, warning that a few bad actors were putting an entire community's reputation on the line. The clip spread fast. It was the first public sign that something about feeding hungry kids didn't add up. Here's the part that makes this story worse, not better. The state saw it coming. Years after the raid, internal records and FBI interviews would surface showing that Minnesota Department of Education employees privately flagged suspicious meal claims long before the case became public. One of the department's own oversight officials later admitted the agency technically had the authority to crack down harder. It just lacked the legal muscle and expertise to actually use it. The department didn't even have a general counsel on staff until 2022, the same year federal agents finally kicked in the door. Bach wasn't operating in total secrecy. She was operating in a system that saw the warning signs and couldn't or wouldn't stop her in time. Weeks later, the FBI moved. Agents raided Feeding Our Future's offices and Bach's home. It became national news almost instantly. The Justice Department would go on to call it, in blunt terms, the country's largest pandemic relief fraud scheme, one that eventually swept up dozens of defendants across the state. Bach's response wasn't to go quiet. She sued the state education department, arguing officials had unfairly tried to stop her from sponsoring more sites, and remarkably, a judge initially sided with her before federal agents raided the nonprofit's offices. At trial, Bach took the stand for hours against her own attorney's advice, trying to paint Feeding Our Future as legitimate. It didn't work. A federal jury convicted her, and prosecutors described a portrait of self-enrichment, shell companies built to funnel money, and stolen funds spent, in the government's words, on luxury vehicles, residential and commercial real estate in Minnesota, and international travel. Later, from jail, Bach gave her first public interview since her arrest. She struck a strikingly different tone than the defiant witness from the trial, saying she wished she could go back and do things differently, to stop things, to catch things, while still arguing that state officials shared the blame. In May 2026, Amy Bach stood before a federal judge one last time. Prosecutors had pushed for a 50-year sentence. What she got was close enough. A 500-month sentence, just over 41 years in prison, and an order to personally pay more than $242 million in restitution. Of the roughly $250 million stolen, investigators say only a fraction has ever been recovered. A federal judge later moved to strip her of what luxury assets remained, including a Porsche, real estate, and cash, some of it tied to property overseas. Bach was never accused of acting alone. Nearly 80 people were eventually charged, dozens convicted, in a scandal that widened far beyond one nonprofit into other state programs, from autism therapy to homeless housing assistance. It became a political flashpoint, too, cited by the Trump administration as justification for an immigration crackdown in Minnesota that set off street protests, and it hovered over then Governor Tim Walz's decision not to seek a third term. Congress got involved as well. The House Oversight Committee opened its own investigation, holding hearings on Minnesota's fraud problem and signaling the probe could expand well beyond this one state's programs. And investigators later found the fraud didn't even stop when the scandal became public in 2022. Some of it, they say, quietly continued for 2 more years, collected by people who should have known the case was already national news. Amy Bach will likely spend the rest of her working life in federal prison for stealing money meant to feed hungry children. The story of how she got there and who helped her is far from over. Next